victim was a girl. This was no accident in a war that had killed over 1,097 civilians since its launch. Parallel to the school massacre, strikes on oil infrastructure compound the crimes. Attacks from Tehran, Shrahan Depot, and Shahi fuel sites unleashed toxic plumes, leading to black rain, soot, sulfur, heavy metals mixed with stormwater, contaminating air, soil, and water. Iran's environmental agency warned of acid rain risks to skin and lungs. WHO head Tedros Ghebreyesus highlighted dangers to children and the elderly. Over 300 environmental incidences documented by March 10th, with pollution from munitions, oil spills, entering drains, and threats to groundwater. These aren't isolated. They're tactical in a broadening war hitting dual-use sites, risking regional catastrophe from the Persian Gulf to the Saudi refineries. Imperial bombs don't just kill, they poison ecosystems, echoing how U.S. sanctions already starved Iran of medicine essentials. And I want to say something about not only these actions, but something about sanctions, because people have to view this present war in context that it's just a phase of war, that there's been an ongoing war. On the question of sanctions, today's bombings cap years of siege. U.S. sanctions that intensified post-2018 JCPOA exit have inflicted mass suffering. A 2025 Lancet Global Health study from 1971 to 2021 links unilateral sanctions to 564,258 excess deaths yearly worldwide, matching armed conflicts toll. Peer-reviewed analysis shows sanctions spike mortality, poverty, and rights abuses, with Iran's people denied cancer drugs, infant formula, and more. The economic warfare paved the way for Epic Fury, launched on February 28th, amid escalating U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear sites. Leadership and defenses, killing Supreme Leader Khamenei. It's regime change by any means. And I just want to say a little bit about the sanctions, because when the U.S. press has reported on the so-called dissidents in Iran, you have to see that it takes place in the context of the sanctions, where people have been denied medicine, their economy has been wrecked by the sanctions, and it creates an atmosphere where, it foments division and protest. I want to add to that what we're seeing right now in Cuba, and really just talk a little bit about that, because Jenny and myself got back from a trip to Cuba as eyewitnesses. And sometimes people just think sanctions are just like this little thing. They don't understand the kind of blockade it means. So I'll just say this very briefly. In Cuba right now, people are living in the dark. There is no oil. It's not an island country that manufactures or has the capacity to develop oil wells or anything like that. It's not on their landmass. And so everything has to be imported. And people sometimes forget that oil powers electricity. Electricity powers plumbing. There's all sorts of different ways in which this cascades. And so if you can imagine being in a rather modern society where people are used to modern healthcare, used to a lot of the things that come with modern living, and suddenly there is no electricity. Suddenly, there are blackouts. There is immense suffering. It means that there is a shortage of food, and people are genuinely suffering. So I just want to say sanctions aren't just, you don't have certain things on your shelf to buy, or groceries or something like that. It's a major, major problem. And it's been amazing so far that under the sanctions and now the tightening blockade where oil can't get through, especially after the assault on Venezuela. So I just wanted to add that before getting into this. But to understand this moment, I think we have to go much further back to 1953, when the U.S. orchestrated the overthrow of Iran, of the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. His crime was nationalizing Iran's oil, asserting that the country's resources should benefit its own people rather than foreign corporations. The coup that removed him installed a dictatorship and set the stage for decades of intervention and conflict. What we're witnessing today is not isolated, but part of a continuous imperialist project, one that punishes countries that seek independence and control over their own resources. And I'll say a little bit more about this history, but part of the reason why I was even willing to give this report is that it is germane really to part of Baltimore's history. There was one of the most vocal anti-Shah movements, especially led by Iranian students in Baltimore, centered around Johns Hopkins, centered around the area around Washington, D.C. And we were participants, those of us who were old enough to have been involved in this back in the 70s. Marching to Washington, D.C., protesting. They had the Shah's daughter, the princess, came and spoke at Johns Hopkins. You know, there's a whole history to that. So I want to go back, say a little bit about 1953. Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, was overthrown in a coup d'etat that strengthened the rule of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. It was instigated by the United Kingdom under the name Operation Boot and the United States under the name TPAJAX, Project of Operation Ajax. The Shah of Iran's secret police were called SAVAK, an acronym for, I cannot pronounce this, but it's really a horrendous security organization, established in 1957 with the help from the CIA and Israel's Mossad. SAVAK was notorious for brutality, surveillance, and torture of political dissidents until its dissolution in 1979 after the revolution that swept the Shah out of Iran. And I'll say this about the part about SAVAK. We knew people here that had to flee Iran to get away from the SAVAK. We also knew people that worked with us who were, one particular person I remember, completely scarred and mutilated his entire face because of the torture in some of the dungeons during the period of Shah. The Shah was hated. And, you know, it's also very important to remember that the government that they overthrew was a progressive government bent on socialist reforms at the time. And not necessarily of the same form that Cuba was, but in terms of nationalizing the oil. And many, many modern programs, women's rights, all of that were very much incorporated. And this is what the U.S. overthrew to place the Shah in power. And I could talk a lot about the women here. I won't. Maybe it'll come up in questions. And I raise this all just to also point out and show how the press attempts to manipulate people's opinions. I mean, people have seen the demonstrations across the U.S. where the press is just touted, you know, these are Iranians or gleeful and happy about the invasion and the bombing of Iran. Well, they're led really by Reza Pahlavi. I'm not good at
you have that one.
That's it.
You're good.
That
The exiled, yeah, that's the one I'm saying. He's the junior. He was the exiled crown prince, and he's the eldest son of Iran's last Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. I mean, actually, that is who's been leading these demonstrations. And when you see some of these flags, if you're not necessarily deeply involved in the history of this region, you may not know, but there was a flag of the Shah. 2026 U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran. He has been promoting himself as a potential transitional leader for a post-Islamic Republic Iran, releasing quote-unquote transition plans and publicly appealing to Western governments for recognition. I want to end just with saying this. Women's History Month demands we reject selective outrage. Imperialism slays Iranian girls while sanctioning their mothers' health care. It torches oil fields, poisoning generations. Workers and oppressed peoples must unite against this machine, from the U.S. streets to Tehran. End the sanctions, stop the bombs, justice for Manab's daughters. Andre, the floor is yours.
Thank you. We've just heard discussions on how the U.S. is trying to do, what's the favorite word they always say on TV? begins with an R.
Regime change.
Yes. They want regime change in countries around the world. Because what they're doing is they're putting in place, as they have sometimes, a puppet government in many different countries that would do the bidding of U.S. multinational corporations, the oil corporations, the wheelers and dealers, and what they have done in calling for regime change, they're really standing against the self-determination of people in a particular country. We see what Prime Minister Mossadegh did before the coup that removed him and placed the Shah in place. Some of the tremendous gains he was doing for women and for the country. We see in Iraq, before George and Bush Sr. and Jr.'s war on Iraq, the improvements that Iraq had made, the improvements in the health care of the people of Iraq, the improvement in the education of the people of Iraq, what was done. We see how Venezuela, under the late President Hugo Chavez and continuing under the administration of President Maduro, the improvements they have made to Venezuela. What the U.S. and its bankers who back the U.S. government are against is the self-determination of these countries to determine for themselves what their plight should be, how they will build their country, whether they're building it as a socialist country or they're doing some measures that may seem as socialist measures, but they're really measures to improve the quality of human life. The reason the U.S. has continued to call for regime change is because we know so well what's in the ground in Venezuela is the oil. What's in the ground of Iran? The oil. The U.S. propped up and the country of Iraq and Iran in the 1980s. This is shortly after the Shah was overthrown. The U.S. propped up both countries to fight each other. Over here, they're giving weapons to Iraq. Over here, they're giving weapons to Iran. And they had a 7-year war against each other. But decades later, they both stood against U.S. imperialism. U.S. imperialism is about control of the resources of the land. I wasn't aware, I've thanked Ginny for the background on Ireland, particularly about the famine, because it was a potato famine. They didn't tell us that there was plenty food there for the Irish people to feed themselves, but that food was being exported down to
New England,
Ireland, Scotland. That was being imported to England, and perhaps Scotland too. I'm not sure, don't know. But that was being used to go to England. So with imperialism, they take over a country, they put a puppet government in place, they take the resources from that land, and they export it around the world. When they export it around the world, do you think the benefits, the economic benefits, the money they get from that goes to that particular country? No. It goes to the banking industry, the financial capitalists that control parts of the world. But each country has a right to say, I want to do this for my people. Over here, I want to do that for my people. The U.S. financial banking interest is not interested in it. All they're interested in is what money they can get out of it. That's what imperialism does. It takes and takes and takes. We hear in the news that word again, regime change. Regime change, the term is nothing new. They have been saying regime change. I'm 71, and when I got involved in politics was 40 years ago. Got to do the addition. Think way back there. And they were always talking about regime change in another country. As a teenager, and actually Sharon as a teenager too, we we stood up with other people around the country against the Vietnam War. That was an attempt by the U.S. government at regime change. What had happened in Vietnam is the French were controlling Vietnam. The French were losing the battle after so many, many years. So the United States thought, oh, look at this. The Vietnamese are weak. We can go in and we can take up where French left off, and we can do it. Because what's in Vietnam? There's rubber, for one thing. And I think tungsten, I'm not sure about tungsten, but there's rubber. So there's something there that the corporations, U.S. and European, because we don't want to leave them out, they're just as evil as the U.S. and that they want. So they figured they would go. The U.S. would go in and fight Vietnam. Ha 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 ha. But April 30th, 1971 was a tremendous victory for the working class of the world because people of Vietnam militarily defeated the U.S. government. There's a president that you might learn about in history class, someone called Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon determined he was going to bomb Vietnam back into the Stone Age. And that's exactly what he did. He used a tactic called carpet bombs and just flattened everything in Vietnam. And we see that being done today, what Israel does to Palestine. We see what the U.S. did to Iraq, bombing and flattening. But when you look at Vietnam today, some 40 years after they defeated U.S. imperialism, under a socialist government in Vietnam, they have rebuilt that city. And it really has been tremendous developments. The U.S. tried to destroy the crop. They sprayed Agent Orange all over, trying to kill crops and kill people in Vietnam. And what did Agent Orange do? Well, just ask any veteran that was in the Vietnam War that 40 years later still suffered from Agent Orange. I have a good friend in New York City who has had a tremendous battle battling back from the debilitating effects of Agent Orange. So this word regime change, always keep it in mind. It means I'm going to control this country. I'm going to have this country do what I want it to do. One of those ways is the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They prop up and they, present themselves as, oh, we're going to help you by giving you loans to do this. But when the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank give a loan to a country, it has so many strings attached. It usually imposes what are called austerity measures. Now, in this country, we don't use that term very much, austerity measures. Only the most radical people that I know often use that term. But other countries know exactly very well what an austerity measure is. It means the denial for the people of that country of the means to live, of the means to have decent housing, of the means to have health care. Some of the most poorest countries are poor because they're doing what? They're paying back the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Right. I don't know if this is a good example, but Haiti is paying back the country of France because France sued them. And they're saying, oh, Haiti had a revolution that did this, so they owe France so much money. Bullshit. They don't owe France a damn thing. So, this war with Iran is an attempt to stop not only the people of Iran from determining for themselves how they will run their own country, which they're doing just fine, absolutely fine right now. And it's the right of any oppressed country to have a right to their own self-determination, determine how they chart their course, how they improve life, the quality of life in their country, how they want to make their educational system work, how they want to make their health system work. It is not for, as I said it already, U.S. and European corporations to determine how these countries will chart their future. Because the countries are charting future for their people. But the banks, from the IMF, the World Bank, the multinational corporations that are in the U.S. and throughout Europe, they don't really give a damn about the other countries. All they're looking for is what resources can we take from these people. To get these resources, we gotta control them. We stand up for the right of all oppressed countries to the right to their own self-determination, and we support their fight against imperialism. Down with imperialism, down with capitalism.
Our last presentation, then we're going to open up the floor by Alec. You want to?
Thanks for coming out, everybody. I swear I'm the last presenter. I'm going to try to be brief.
I said that like 4 times.
And then we're going to have discussion, and people really should ask questions and dig in. So my name is Alec. I'm a People's Power Assembly, Struggle for Socialism Party, local organizer and attorney. And yeah, I'm going to talk about the stakes of this current war in Iran, because they're very high. And they're not just high for the people of Iran, which it's their country. You know, a lot of allegations are thrown at Iran: terror regime, this state sponsor terror, that, you know, destabilizing the region. But I think the biggest destabilizer are the people turning the regions into a dumpster fire, and that's not Iran. That's the U.S. That's Britain, Israel. Mm-hmm. And so for Iran, they're fighting for their country, for their lives, for the broader community of Shia Islam. You know, you've groups in Lebanon and other countries intervening. They're fighting for their lives. They're fighting for their right to exist. But there's stakes for us too here in this country, and some of it's gas prices, but it really does go beyond that. So, going to go ahead and dive in. So this current war, a lot is made in the media making it seem like Trump woke up one day and kind of decided he wanted to go to war. This war against Iran, the planning, the conceptualization did not start in the Trump administration. It didn't start in the Biden or the Trump before that, or the Obama before that, or even Bush before that. This essentially, since the revolution of '79, the U.S. has wanted to get the Islamic Republic to fall, and so they can have their way, like Andre said. And particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union, easier for the U.S. to exert power globally. All sorts of think tanks in the late '90s, early 2000s printed all sorts of things about how Brookings Institute, different think tanks like that, said, we're going to knock off Syria, we're going to knock off the PLO in Palestine, we're going to knock off Hezbollah in Lebanon, we're going to knock off Iraq and Iran. They've gotten everybody pretty much, except for Iran. Iran is really what's left. And, I mean, General Wesley Clark has talked about that. That's not a secret. Lots of people talked about the plans for this war older than some of the people in this room. So, I think we have to ask some questions. One, so what is the U.S., and Andre talked some about this, the U.S., and really not just the U.S. government, but the wealthy who support the government, what do they hope to accomplish by unseating the Islamic Revolution in Iran? So Andre also brought up regime change. I think in this case, and it's kind of shown the U.S. strategy, regime destruction would be enough. Because as we've seen sort of all over the world, the U.S. destroys a country, and then if no solid single power comes up, that's fine. There's a vacuum; they can push their will. So, and part of this is definitely oil. I mean, really, part of this is about oil. In the U.S. ruling class, like they always want to do with oil or any natural resource, it's not necessarily about seizing it and being able to market it themselves, but they will do that if they can. But it's also about stopping Iran's ability to export crude oil to get processed other places and sold, because ultimately there's money not going into their pockets at all.
Right.
They see none of that. Right. It gets around sanctions. They see none of that money, and that's a problem for them. We're in a period where, as imperialism declines, they need more profit, more profit, more profit, more markets. It's never enough. And Iran is part of that, and they don't feel like they can leave the money that's in Iran on the table anymore. So you destroy their ability to export oil. Either the U.S. oil barons make money by exporting their capital and investing in new private Iranian oil companies, or they just destroy it, and then everybody has to buy their oil anyway, or the oil of their partners like Saudi Arabia or the UAE. And something, I wanted to mention is that right now, U.S. banks in any business venture in Iran don't make any money. They can't invest in anything because of their own sanctions, because of the Islamic Republic's policy. So they're desperate to break that. And it won't just be oil. Tourism could open up for them. Also, they make money by waging the actual war. They're already talking about increasing production again. That means Northrop, General Dynamics, whoever makes a bunch of weapons, the U.S. government buys them all and either sells them for nickels on the dollar or just gives them away. And they call it military aid. So they're desperate for new markets, and they're desperate to take a shot at a huge ally for Russia and China. 90% of Iran's oil gets sold to China. That's massive amounts of energy that China gets and money that Iran receives. That's something the U.S. wants to stop because they're not making money off it. So the question I ask is, what does the U.S. hope to accomplish? They hope to accomplish by destroying Iran's ability to defend itself, destroying Iran's ability to export oil, and then improving their ability to intervene in the market in one way or another. So that's kind of economically. There's reason for them wanting to destroy Iranian society so they can make money off the natural resources or prevent anybody else from making money off the natural resources. Part of this is also it's the region's politics and strategically. So ever since the 90s, and especially the Iraq War, the U.S. has had military bases all over the region. Everybody acts like it's this great crime that Iran hits these bases. Well, I want to ask, why the hell are these bases? Right. Bahrain, Qatar. Why are they there? Why are so many weapons of war there? And Iran has been, the biggest thorn in their side. They've refused to bat Israel. They've supported the resistance group that the U.S. media calls terrorists. But again, I asked who the real terrorists are: the people picking up arms to defend their country, or the people bombing these countries. And so Iran helped found Hezbollah and supplied it in Lebanon, same with Ansar Allah in Yemen. And the Yemeni revolution, the Houthis, the media calls them Ansar Allah, that was a challenge to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is a major U.S. ally. Iran, over the decades, sent tens of millions in U.S. dollars in aid to Palestinian resistance factions. This included investment and aid shipments of weaponry, medicine, food, clothing to Hamas, Palestinian Front, People's Front for Liberation of Palestine, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Even though there were some cultural and political differences between Iran and the resistance of Palestine, that never stopped them from supporting them. And one thing I want to mention, so the name, Iran named this defense against the U.S. True Promise 4. And, we really should recognize True Promise 1 happened in 2024, and it was an Iranian intervention with missiles and drones on behalf of Palestine to stop the genocide. So that's what this military comes out of. It's not a tawdry thing. This military operation, this ultimately grew out of Iran's interventions against the U.S.-Israeli genocide in Gaza. And you still find videos of the people in West Bank and Gaza cheering as Iranian missiles fall. And one more thing, when Iran did intervene for Palestine, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait all assisted the U.S. and Israel in shooting down their drones, shooting down the missiles, essentially siding with the genocide, siding with apartheid, siding with Israel. These from Muslim countries. And I mentioned this when I was in Egypt in 2023 for the attempted global conscious convoy from Cairo to Gaza. We never got out of the city because the Egyptian government's with the U.S. What the organizers and the people in Egypt told me is that they think there's a failure in the West to really understand how these countries, all these countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, these are all total U.S. satellites.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, they might as well be states, really. They are totally in the pocket of the U.S., and they will do whatever the U.S. asks, even if that means allowing a genocide in Gaza and turning on Iran. So, I have one more question to ask, and then I'll show my pie hole. So, what would the fall of Iran mean for the global working class? Well, it would obviously be an awful development for the working class in Iran, for the people of Iran. We only have to look at other examples to see what happens when imperialism removes a stable, democratically elected country to open markets to expand their influence. We can look at Iraq, Yugoslavia, Libya, and Syria. Bombed Iraq for however many years. The country was war-torn for however many years, and to this day they have a weak government. They've got resistance factions who are fighting with Iran against the U.S., but they're still recovering. They lost hundreds of thousands of people, and their domestic industry's never fully recovered. Yugoslavia, the U.S. bombed it into oblivion in the late 90s, and it's now 6 different countries. They've been in an inflation crisis since, and they're essentially just fodder for cheap imported goods from the rest of Europe. So their purpose is to buy goods. And then you look at places like Libya and Syria, which the U.S. really destroyed completely. Libya still has like 3 different governments, and they're always fighting each other, and there's terrible trafficking crisis, awful sexual crimes again. Sharon talked about this selective caring. What happened to women in Libya and oppressed genders in Libya and children after the fall of what people call the Gaddafi regime is terrible. It's and never would have happened if the U.S. didn't bomb the country in oblivion. Syria is now an ISIS fundamentalist haven where women, religious and ethnic minorities get slaughtered in the street, going from a secular society before. So we see what happens, and that's what will happen to Iran. That's why I said it's destruction. They'll just destroy it if they have to and leave Iran to their vices. So it would be terrible for Iran. Second, it would be a crushing blow to the countries in what's called the multipolar world movement. China, like I said, imported roughly 90% of Iran crude's oil export. Russia is also heavily invested in Iranian agriculture and things like that, and militarily. The German drones that Russia has used to fight NATO for 4 years are of Iranian design. The Iranian and Russian militaries are only able to fight the way they do because they're invested in each other. The U.S. knows that. This is absolutely a collateral attack on Russia, but really on China. 10% of China's fuel comes from Iran. To lose 10% of your fuel, which is what the U.S. wants, would be devastating to the people of China. And ultimately, it would be devastating to the people here because a large U.S. monopoly on oil means higher prices, ultimately. It's already happening. Don't let the media fool you. They want this. They want the prices to skyrocket. That's why the war is going to go on for a little bit. And finally, a fall of the Islamic Republic, it would essentially mean the complete ceding of the region to the U.S. It would be the completion of the goal the U.S. set out 30 years ago to completely dominate the region through Israel, their puppet Israel, with no resistance. They don't want resistance. They're tired of having to deal with these people. They want to be able to plunder and dominate however they like. So for the working class people of Iran, of that region, a clear U.S. victory in this war, the destruction of Iran, its inability to organize a central society would be devastating to the people there and to the people here. So yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.
The floor is open really to discussion and hear everybody out, regardless of your opinions. If you have a question too, no question is off the table, so to speak, or if you don't know something, ask us. So the floor is open for anybody who has a comment or a discussion or question.
The Iranian Republic supported Malcolm X. They made stamps Yes. So they made Samson Malcolm X. They honor him on the day of his assassination. I think also on his birthday. The previous Ayatollah was vocally supportive of the black struggle here in the United States, and even now, once the war started, they even said that the war we're waging isn't against the people, the oppressed people of the United States, or and they even have I forget who exactly, but even specified isn't against the black population of the U.S. because what's going on is white supremacy. It is the same struggle. What they did to Reverend Turner even talked about this at our demonstration downtown. When the bombing of that school in Iran is exactly like the church bombing that killed the schoolgirls in Birmingham, or the bombing of Tulsa. Like this is the strategy of white supremacy, and the resistance to it historically has always been the same. When things get that bad, we saw the Black Power movement and then armed black struggle, and now we're seeing internationally anti-imperialist armed struggle in all forms. So, yeah.
Anybody else? I don't know. I recognize your face.
Oh, me?
You, yes.
Oh.
You had your hand up. Go ahead.
Petros.
Can I just say this? If I don't know your
yeah.
name, it's also a question if the sun is coming in because daylight saving time started, so I can't even see.
That's all good.
So anyway, go ahead.
So you got a map here,
Yep.
especially because I see Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and then I see that Egypt and Sudan, like based on like what y'all know, and I know like there were some tensions rising up in Eritrea, like as that genocide has been going on. Do you know anything about the migration patterns right now? Are people getting pushed into Egypt, into Sudan, going into Eritrea? Do you know if maybe some of those military bases on the water are moving into Djibouti right now? Or has everything been focused in like the Emirates and Pakistan? Like, because I recently saw, I think something left, a boat left Singapore recently.
Mm-hmm.
But do you know of anything that's going on? Just think.
Good question.
Or I guess, sorry.
Anybody want to follow that up with a comment on that?
I know that Iran shutting down the Straits of Hormuz and targeting military bases in the UAE and infrastructure in the UAE has stopped the UAE's ability to fund the RSF, which is the main contributing factor to the genocide and war in Sudan. The Sudanese people actually, due to Iran striking the UAE, are actually able to successfully counterattack the RSF, take their lands back, and kick those genociders out. I don't believe any military bases in Africa have been hit. Iran said that only bases that have actively kind of been active, like as Alex said in True Promise, that through the True Promise operations are being targeted in any country that openly deals with the U.S. and Israel is kind of the main target right now. But in terms of immigration, I wouldn't be able to tell you, I'm sorry. But I do know Iran's military actions have stopped the RSF from being able to carry out their genocide in Sudan and kind of be that puppet for the West to control the region there.
So, okay.
I'll just say just very quickly, I know there's a lot of refugees created in Lebanon right now. There's tremendous. I think that's kind of widespread in the region where they're going. They're going wherever they can to escape the Israeli bombing in particular, backed by the U.S. So that's another whole part of the war against the Lebanese people that's happening right now.
1 million.
1 million, right? And back there.
Yeah. Hi, my name's Cecile. So there's like an emotional or like affective response from from a portion of the Iranian diaspora that's in the U.S. and that is that. So when the decapitation happened of the Ayatollah, it was described, or there was an emotional charge that it is complicated, anti-war, but this is a sigh of relief because it was an oppressive regime. And I'm just curious about, and I mean, maybe you explain this, but maybe I'm just having trouble following the, sort of like the history of like what were the material implications of like what the Ayatollah was doing or what the diaspora is claiming they're doing that would necessitate this like emotional response of like, well, anti-war, but sigh of relief, but we can breathe, but this was a bad regime.
I'll say, I talked a little bit, and maybe somebody else wants to say something, but let me just say this. From the report that I gave, I mean, the hypocrisy of the U.S. in this whole big question. I mean, clearly the U.S. set up the conditions that led to the difficulties that the Iranian people, were suffering from. The protests around oil prices, around food, all of that, were set up by the sanctions, number one. I certainly think, and I'm just saying this from my own personal point of view, much of the pro-U.S. war sentiment from the diaspora, the Iranian diaspora, a certain segment comes from this reactionary segment that is traces its roots back to the Shah of Iran.
Yeah.
But I am sure, like in all things, there are individuals and people that were in opposition to the Iranian government for a variety of reasons. And so I'm sure that there's sort of a mixed sentiment going on. But what's really been pushed by the U.S. media, I believe, is propaganda to get the U.S. population to buy the idea that this was a just and glorious war. And there have been people who have, I've seen at least some different opinions of people of the Iranian diaspora in the U.S. who are opposed to the war, even if they're not in support of the Iranian government. There's also, I've seen clippings actually on some Chinese media of people from around the world that are Iranian that are actually going back to Iran to fight for the country.
Yep.
So it's like all things, it's complex. But I think for those of us in the U.S., the biggest thing is to get the boot of imperialism off of the Iranian people so that the Iranian people can determine for their own selves. That's why I went back and talked about 1953, when there was a secular, progressive government that the U.S. overthrew. And so any attempt for governments really to develop independently, different movements emerge because of this, regardless of what we think about them or what people in the U.S. might think of the Iranian government. And I think that Andre outlined it very well. We're for self-determination. Let the Iranian people decide. But they can't decide if there's, sanctions and people are choked and starving. It's just like we used to say years ago, I kind of came out of the women's movement, the right of women to decide whether, for their own bodies, whether they want to have children or not. But they can't have a real decision if you don't have food for your children, if you don't have health care, if you don't have the things that are needed to survive, then it's not really completely ever a choice under capitalism. Even though, there's a choice and some women have the opportunity to get health care and others don't. That's another problem. But so it's complicated but simple at the same time. Anyhow, I maybe went too long. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to offer an explanation that also segued into my comment that I wanted to make. No population, of any nation is a monolith, right? No one people of a country is going to feel the same way about any particular thing. But what's really determinative of who's going to feel what way about a certain thing is their position in class society. We see it in all sorts of populations: Cuba, Venezuela, people who have been chased out by a working class revolution, who have ruling class position, ruling class aspirations, ruling class creature comforts, all these things. So of course those people are going, like the ruling class Venezuelans that saw the Bolivarian Revolution as a threat to them. Of course they're going to celebrate Maduro's kidnapping. They think Maduro's at the center of all their problems. They think the Bolivarian Revolution is at the center of all their problems, when it's really not. This kind of thing, the U.S. understands it very well. The ruling class understands it very well. After the Chinese Revolution in the 50s, is not a mistake. In the 60s later, they passed the Immigration Act of 1968, which was a specific brain drain of people who had benefited from the pre-revolutionary system in China. You know, people in ruling class circles, people who already have some amount of capital, people who have higher levels of education. They wanted to get all those people out of China, not only to weaken the Chinese Revolution, but to bolster the propaganda against it. And you know, one of the so I wanted to segue into a question I got asked when we were doing jail support for Maduro when we went up to New York the first time. We were getting interviewed by a local station, and the question they asked was, "What would be so bad if the U.S. was in control of the oil?" I was like, "Oh my god, oh wow!" You know, and it was a good wake up moment for me because I take for granted, you know, what kind of questions people have about this thing, like. And I'm glad Alec raised Syria because that's an important illustration of how things play out when the U.S. is in control, but also the Philippines. My mother's from the Philippines. I've been back and I've learned a lot about the Philippines through the movement, and that is a place where the U.S. is in control. The people are not in control of their own natural resources. The number one export of the Philippines is human beings. As labor, cheap labor, and you know, the natural resources are under control of the big multinational foreign corporations, usually from the U.S., but not exclusively. And then, you know, and just like Syria now that's your answer. That's what happens when the U.S. is in charge. Is those natural resources are being exploited, including human labor, for the profit of the U.S. ruling class, and you know, of course, there's going to be a segment of a particular class standing of the population that is in support of U.S. being in control, but they certainly do not represent the whole of those populations. Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to the questions. Forgive me if I turn all the way around. But I do think even it's probably even important to name what is being said, because there's a myriad of things that are being said, but there's always a through line of a particular kind of narrative. It's like they arrest everyone. There's lots of people in jail. The women are mistreated. The women they have to wear hijabs, and even to the point of women. Life, freedom, and that psyop, right? So that we can actually speak to like what is and isn't occurring, because like if you look at even some of the videos that they show in Tehran right now, they're interviewing women without their hijabs on, like
Right.
they have no head covering, right? And you're being told in this very moment that women have no rights and they have to wear it, but you're seeing people are being interviewed without it, right? Which means that there is a process in which there are conversations being had between the society of people and the government of people, even if there's a disagreement around certain things. And much of it is the overwhelming Islamophobia. Like many of us in this room probably watched the episode of Shaws of Sunset before, but you see that there's ways that they show Iran, or have always for decades showed Iran or depicted it in movies that are like darkened, or they're always terrorists, or they're always this looming figure that's creeping in the background, deceptive, so that anything that's being said automatically, like, it synthesizes with you that, oh, okay, well, that could be true because I remember I once heard, or I remember I once saw, right? So I do think it's always important to actually name what is it that people are saying, because people don't know anything about the Iranian government, even to the point that I think the conversation today that I heard was saying that the supreme leader is like in charge of, or like running the nation, when they have a president and they have a prime minister.
Right.
You know,
Right.
women are fully involved in the government, and they're involved in their tech and science field, which is an extraordinary field. It's probably one of the leading in the world. And women are deeply embedded in that. So even how they talk about certain things. And then also ask yourself, who's being arrested? If you live in a revolutionary nation and you're shouting down for it to fall, you might be arrested. So those are type of, conversations that have to have that. And that's not to say that there are not internal struggles between workers, because the sanctions really have effects on the business class and the society as a whole. They really have damaging effects on the people, and they do. The point of the sanctions is so that people do turn on their government, or they blame their government for their strife. And so you see much of that, but they're significantly politically sophisticated. The people in Iran, even now if you go and you watch these viral clips, they're very clear about who their immediate enemy is, even if they have disagreements with the government. Right. And so the initial protests that we've seen before the bombing, much of that was because the U.S. Raised inflation up to 40% overnight. Who can survive like that, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but within 2 days, there were conversations between the workers and the government. So how do we figure this out? How do we resolve that? And in that space of time, the Mossad agents are coming in. Yep. Mm-hmm. The CIA agents are coming in to cause more destabilization. So you never get to hear it was resolved. Just like you never get to hear there has been ongoing conversations around what, women in the hijab. Ongoing conversations. You don't hear that the government actually has dialogue, because we don't get to have dialogue with our government. Right. So there's a way that because we are denied particular rights here, we don't have certain rights here, or even as women, we have zero rights here, that there's a one-to-one kind of projection where folks are like, oh no, you have to listen to these people. You have to listen to, this kind of lived experience narrative without any consideration of like, well, who's speaking? Mm-hmm. Who's speaking? And what are they saying? And so I think oftentimes that's probably the more important question. Well, what are they saying? When you hear somebody, mention that, the diaspora is saying these things. Well, what things? Mm-hmm. And that way you can actually address those things.
Andre?
Okay. I came across the other day an article in Black Agenda Report by Margaret Kimberly. And in that couple of her paragraphs, she cites the war propaganda has worked very well in depicting Iranian leadership as evil, incarnate theocrats who oppress women and torture opponents. And then in the next paragraph, she goes on, while Westerners judge societies based upon whether women wear short skirts and don't have to cover their hair, according to a United Nations report, Iranian women make up more than half of all university students. And literacy rates for women have more than doubled since the 1979 revolution that threw out the Shah of Iran. She goes on to say, these facts don't count when people who think of themselves as being well-informed instead choose to follow war propaganda inculcated by their political leadership. We get that war propaganda every day in the capitalist big business media. They're doing it about Iran. They did it about Iraq. Much lies. They do the war propaganda about Cuba, about Venezuela. In the 1980s, they did it about Nicaragua following Nicaragua's successful Sandinista revolution. And there's a role that war propaganda plays. And even as Margaret, as she titled her article, How Liberals Support Trump's War Against Iran. Yep. So while you're saying, on the one hand, I think what she's saying is, on the one hand, while you're saying you're against war, and then they say, but their government was really bad. That's really helping to support the war effort when you say that. If you're going to be against the war, you be against the war, period. You don't try to qualify, oh, I'm against the war, but they were such and such. Who says they have to go? People in the U.S.? No. We'll let the people of that country determine when their leadership has to go.
Other hands? No discussion? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think to add on to the conversation, at the same time we see that they creating this propaganda against Iran. We see that police killings still continue across. Somebody had just got killed recently in Baltimore City, and they still continue to kill people through ICE and other forces. So at the same time they worry about another country, the things that they doing to their own citizens continues. But I think it's important to speak about the propaganda going on about what's actually happening on the ground. So right now, there's been a lot of shifting in the conversation, even from the very beginning on how the strikes began. Was it Israel? Was it United States? So I think that right now we see the government really kind of fumbling with how to describe this situation, which we want to be quick, but which keeps continuing to drag on. I think that's most indicated with the fact that he had the meeting that was going to be done with China has been pushed back, just indicating how severe the situation is. But right now, the United States has already pumped trillions of dollars, I believe, into this war. But we see that what was mentioned that Iran has been continuously striking all the military bases around, including things such as the Citibank in Dubai and the Amazon web browser services, bless you, and other places. And I think that one thing that the United States and Israel has been doing has been trying to mitigate the amount of damage being done to places like Tel Aviv right now. The strikes continue, although the United States claims that the firepower of Iran is diminishing. We see that these strikes have only been growing greater by the day. So right now, this is important to understand that this is a situation that will be continuous and ongoing, as the United States don't know how long they're going to be in this for. I think it's important also to understand that this also shows the United States as an empire, and why it's important to understand the concept. The United States has 800 military bases across the globe. I think that also the analysis that we've been having, which really started with Venezuela, shows the imperial overstretch. So they had to take the troops, a lot of the military coming from Venezuela had to make it all the way over to Iran. Some of these forces that we've seen, such as the USS Gerald Ford, was only supposed to be running for a schedule of 6 months, but is 9 months over, suffering from clogged toilets and fires on the ship, which should really be indicative of the state of the U.S. The troops they had to pull from the Indo-Pacific during the exercise, they had to pull to Iran, which really shows you that they are stretched. And during our recent briefing, they mentioned that secure budgeting was one of the issues. So this is not something that the United States was prepared for, and this was a grave miscalculation. So I think it's important to understand that the United States, what our comrade calls the psychopathology of the colonizer, is the United States thinks it can continue to, do these escapades as we've seen in Venezuela, as we've seen with the starvation in Cuba. But the United States shows it does not understand the revolutionary energy of these of Iran. Despite killing the supreme leader, the former president, and others, they continue to resist because, as we know, those with oppression comes resistance. So the Iranian people are going to continue to resist, and they have learned from the 12-day war from last year. They said that they're not going to allow for the same things that happened last year to happen this time. So there's going to be increased strikes, and there's going to be increased resistance. So I think this is especially important because the U.S. is in war, has been, in a war that they is not prepared for, and it's only going to be more resistance coming from Iran. So I think it's especially important to understand some of the effects we're going to see in the U.S. As mentioned, the Strait of Hormuz has been closed. 20% of oil comes from there, and oil prices are only going to go up. Also, with the fertilizer mentioned, most of the fertilizer comes out of the Strait of Hormuz, which is going to lead undoubtedly to hunger, across the globe. So I think this is important to also mention how the U.S. is really being exposed right now for their brazenness and their gangsterism. There has been no support from, very little support from NATO. Countries like Germany and France said no, and the only support from Britain thus far has been the use of ciphers to launch attacks. So I think this should be, this should really help people understand that the United States is being seen as a rogue state globally right now with the crimes they are committing. This is not the first or second time they have committed a crime like that just this year. I think this also emphasizes why we need to be understanding that they're still trying to host the FIFA games in the United States, despite the genocide they support, despite these continuous unprovoked wars they're supporting. So I think this is especially important of a time to show the contradictions and to show the United States for what it is, an empire founded on settler colonialism.
I want to also name too, because President said something I think is really important, even in terms of like what's happening on the ground, like certain pressure points, because they had to remove THAAD from South Korea, but they also just had to remove the radar from Tobago because they are so these are things that, well, for at least a decade they have been organizing against that, the displacement and all of that. But this has been an ongoing fight to get that radar off of Tobago, which we all knew was being used for the kidnapping of Venezuela, in spite of what Kamala was saying, etc. And then overnight it's gone. So there's certain pressure points of areas where us as workers globally can be taken advantage of, because the U.S. is really down bad. But to say a declining empire or a declining beast is still a ravaging beast, right? So it's still going to be striking everywhere, including us home right here, because we're the closest. But just to keep in mind that all of these things are simultaneously happening, to President's point.
With your point on the Ford, those fires started on board, and the clogging of the toilets was started by sailors protesting against their deployment. Also speaking to your point on it shows the relationship of the U.S. and its population. I mean, and everything you said with the deaths here, especially here in Baltimore being so local. Also to connect Iran even locally here, there's the Bethlehem ship, or what used to be the steel plant in Cherry Hill. They now make unmanned surface vessels. So the drones that support U.S. naval operations, they were tested in the Caribbean. Now they're also conducting operations in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean alongside U.S. Naval forces. And that's right in our backyard. As the city wants to give $600 million to the police, as they want to continue investment in private investments and military contracts, we see the effect of our money that could be going to supporting schools. It's transportation, education, all this stuff, but instead is being invested into the occupation of, because it's all connected, oppressed and working class people here and oppressed and working class people abroad. But we're seeing through the Ford, through the example provided by the Ford of people's resistance, of them clogging the pipes. They're finding skivvy shirts and shorts, shoes, all sorts of shit in these pipes. The fire was started by sailors. 600 sailors, lost their thing, and that's all because they don't want to be over there. They don't want to, because they also saw, that a lot of that is, the Navy uses their sailors as they put them in these situations to fight for their fight for your life. In these life or death scenarios, they don't control where their ships go. They don't do anything, but they put them in scenarios where it's fight or flight for profit. They learned, and these sailors kind of saw, when Ansar Allah was fighting back in Yemen against U.S. operations, there's deck crew and pilots that were talking about how they had never seen an enemy fight that so hard. Yemen, the poorest country in the world, scared the U.S. Navy and made them fucking run back to the naval base in Saudi Arabia, where they had all their other countries able to shoot down this stuff, because Ansar Allah's missiles and drones and everything forced the Navy to retreat. And that's why we're seeing the fleet off the coast of Iran had to retreat to Oman, because those Iranian anti-ship missiles, those drones, the U.S. isn't used to people resisting so hard. It's been able to have this hegemony for so long, especially following the fall of the Soviet Union. That now when they're trying to re-engage that control, people have learned their lessons. People have been watching. And people have been learning, and people are saying, we're not falling for it. Iran themselves said, we're not doing no ceasefire. It is an end of the war on our terms or else. And that they have all right to do that. I just thought that was all really it. Just add to the conversation. I think it was really good. Everybody's saying.
If there's anybody who hasn't said anything, please raise your hand. And also, if people have any questions or comments in Ginny's report on Ireland. And then I'll say these things. So, come on, well, go ahead.
I do want to say something in defense of Iran. The culture of Persia, just kind of on a cultural civilization kind of point of view. I mean, a lot of the countries that the U.S. considers their enemies, I've always noticed they're like really great civilizations when you go into them and you really kind of study. They're often like these ancient cultures that have so much richness and so much just diversity and sheer culture compared to the US, which is just a settler colonial genocide and slavery kind of capitalist situation. But just a few things, like, because I've been interested, I was working with refugees and immigrants for like 5 years, and so I met a lot of people from Afghanistan, and from them I realized that Tajikistan and Afghanistan and Persia, they all speak like dialects of Persian. And when you get deeper into it and you start seeing like the differences or like the commonalities that they have, right now is like their New Year celebration, and this New Year thing that they have, it stretches back to not even the year 0, which is Jesus, but like 500, at least 500 or even 1,000 years before that. Like they basically Jewish idea of Passover and that thing about the bitter herb and the egg and the different foods that symbolize things. These are Persian ideas that they got during the Babylonian exile and other stuff. But I mean, the ancientness of Persia goes back even before like Egypt, like I mean, well, not before, but like contemporaneously. They have so many cool cities that you wouldn't even know of. Like if you just see on movies, like, oh, okay, it's just like turban terrorists that live in the desert. Right. That's totally not what this fucking country is. It's like so many beautiful mountains, snow-capped. They have snow leopards over there. There's different city called Yazd where they invented like a certain ancient type of like cotton candy that they mix with pistachios and saffron. They have like a bicycle. There's like a big bicycle culture and hot air balloon culture in the middle of Yazd. They're really loving about pomegranates. They have many orchards where they're squeezing fresh pomegranate juice. It's a big component of their holiday around Christmas, Yalda, where everyone dresses in like beautiful, luxurious red and eat red fruits, and they're reading from the book of Hafiz poetry, like that they're fortune telling, like, you know, it's very kind of mystical. Even the idea of magic or mages, magush, these are all like these ancient Persian ideas. Other random stuff that they have just that shows the beauty and the romance of their culture. They have an ice cream which is like flavored with rose water and saffron and pistachio that they can even make into like little wafer sandwiches that they're eating. Everybody knows about Hafez and Rumi, who like together with Shia Islam and the Sufis, they were having like basically a whole chain of like religion, dialogue, poetry, literature, all the way from like Isfahan, Yazd, Herat, and then from there to Kabul. And there was like all these people that was in dialogue with each other and having like universities and shit and just making all kinds of like love poetry, talking about wine, about roses. They make all these kind of like gardens and fountains. You can see many of their miniature paintings that they have, especially on poetry. It has like rare birds like peacocks, phoenixes, ancient, just like there's so much that I could keep saying about like Bactria, Elam, Badakhshan, the Sogdians, King Dariush, Balochistan. Like there's just so much shit there. And then meanwhile in the US, like the way that they just portray them and justify, it's like, to me, like the US is like some stupid little arrogant pipsqueak that's trying to destroy the people that, yeah, right now their situation governmentally is fucked, but like their ancientness, the richness of the culture. That's why when you see their general that they're coming on, they're like, we're have a courageous, strong, and resolute people. I mean, you better believe them because like it's really a beautiful and romantic culture.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was just going to say a couple things before we start with announcements, unless there's any other comments, because I don't want to cut off the discussion. I wanted to. I just wanted to quote, from the French General Mikhail Yurkalev, who just compared joining Trump's Iran war to, quote, buying cheap tickets for the Titanic after it already hit the iceberg. This comes from the French, who we know are no friends of the oppressed. But it just shows you. Just want to end up with a little bit of an up note, because I think what Erica said was very, very important. Terms of, and I don't think she used the exact words, but it's the same thing. A wounded beast is a very dangerous beast. And so we don't at all take for granted the tremendous destruction that U.S. imperialism and capitalism is possible wreaking on the world's people. But our job really is to intensify the struggle against it. And there is, and Alex said it in his report, this is going to reverberate very deeply in our community in different ways. I know that Carrington's been very active and other members in the PPA in fighting the police killings on Hawkins, on BJ, and actually police killings and racism are very interlocked with imperialist war. There's while it might not seem immediate, it is definitely interlocked. And we've seen it right here in Maryland and Baltimore, just one killing after the other. But also the whole question of inflation. On one level, it's like a contradictory thing. I mean, they do want they're not too upset about the oil prices going up. There's a lot of money to be had in that. But like all things, even, quote, good things for the capitalists are a contradiction, because sooner or later the inflation that oil prices will bring about in the general economy can lead to another crisis. And so, down the road, a lot of this is going to be very adverse for the working class, who's going to suffer, because Trump and them ain't going to suffer. So I think that we have a lot to do and a lot of concrete things to do on the ground. Our work around fighting police terror, our work against ICE, our work against war in general. And it's our job really in this room, the many of us, no matter what group you're with, is to really push against imperialist war. And there's activities coming up that we're deeply involved in on different levels for different reasons, but there's no King's March, which the main reason for that is to educate people beyond even the fight against Trump, to involve people in the fight against imperialism as a whole. And then, of course, there's May Day coming up with the no work, no schools, no shopping day. We're raising the issue of general strike. Whether we'll be there or not doesn't matter. We have to keep raising these things to the broader working class. So I think there's a lot to be done. I mean, we're, at least I don't know myself, I can speak for, I don't know about anybody else in the room, we're not privy to what the strengths are and how much gas is in the tank of the Iranian military. We don't know that. I can say for myself that we hope that there's a lot, and we're rooting on their side all the way. But we don't know, and we don't know what the outcome is. And the truth may be that if Iran survives, that may be the big victory of all time. But nevertheless, it's certainly already, you can see that it is like going in the direction of provoking a global war, World War III, whatever you want to call it, however you want to nickname it, it will draw in others. And it's already, a question of the war. A lot of it's aimed against China's economy. A lot of it's aimed against Russia, which they have, pushed Russia into a war in Ukraine. And we don't know where all that's going. And then we see some things that we might disagree, because we are definitely for solidarity with Iran, definitely for solidarity with Cuba and Venezuela. But we did learn today some good news that Russia is sending 2 oil tankers in defiance of the blockade to Cuba. Hopefully it gets through, because there's also issues too whether the U.S. will militarily stop it. So I personally expect that the war is not about to let up. And as somebody who's lived through the Iraq war, this war is likely more to widen, and we should be prepared for that, including ground troops, which there's a lot of talk about it. And we may think, oh my God, that's crazy. They can't do ground troops. They know that there will be an uprising even in the U.S. against it. But many people thought it was crazy that they would attack Iran again. So, be prepared. I mean, Trump says, like they said with Venezuela for weeks and weeks, we were all on edge, and I think we're all hoping it wouldn't happen. And some people even could go into denial about it. And then suddenly they went in and illegally kidnapped the leadership of the Venezuelan revolution. So I'll leave it at that. If you're not signed up to be on the PPA mailing list, please do. And if you're not with the group, join the group. I'm going to end with that.
We meet back here every Wednesday, 6
Yes,
p.m.
every Wednesday. We're here at 6 o'clock. We're either organizing, doing work, or having education.
Can I have a share announcement, please?
Yeah, go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this Saturday, y'all always come to our town hall. We have an upcoming town hall this Saturday on collective organizing. So as we have seen with the police killings,
Thank you.
as we've seen with the police killings, we understand that it's important for us to come together and organize as in a coalition. So we're asking y'all to come out and support and be engaged in some of these conversations. Yeah. And y'all, yeah, it's gonna be from 1 to 3 p.m. Doors open at 12:30. And if y'all need updates, y'all can go to BAP_Baltimore on Instagram.
Does anybody follow our Instagram?
I follow your Instagram.
In case I just got
And Casey made me very hungry, so there's food left here, not quite as nice.
Still think about that.
Oh yeah, I decided I was gonna pick up Afghan food on the way home. Yeah.
Erica, you had your hand up.
No, I was sitting on my phone.
Rancho.
Oh.
Damn.
I don't know.
That's like really unfortunate. Like the only two.
Okay, gotcha.
How do we?